We've been going for 30 years. We're a 5-piece band, and actually there are 3 of us who have been there, who've done the 30 years long service.
Get Radio Breakfast with Rich Smith.
I've spoken to loads of phenomenal people already this week. A big thank you to Pet Twin, Echo Vector X, Tom Dalby. Yesterday was really great to catch up with everyone, and we've got loads more discoveries to make this week as well. And we're catching up right now with Andy from Magpie Lane. Good morning, Andy.
Good morning, Rich.
Thanks so much for joining us and being part of Get Radio's Band Week. A lot of the bands that we've spoken to, and this is just sort of seeing bits and bobs that we've spoken to recently, have been quite new bands forming from the pandemic and forming sort of in the last few years. However, you've been going ever so slightly longer than that, haven't you?
We have, yes. We've been going for 30 years. We're a 5-piece band, and actually there are 3 of us who have been there, who've done the 30 years long service. And actually, even the newest member has been in the band, I can't remember, probably something like 18 years, something like that. So,
Wow.
So we're quite well established on the Oxford folk scene.
In terms of being established and having longevity, I mean, there are bands that can't last that long, that don't last that long. How do you keep that longevity?
Well,
how do you keep it fresh?
Well, it's partly is that we've had a few changes of sort of lineup, but not many, and we've always really got on really well, and we have a laugh. In fact, often at practices, the difficulty is, right, okay, we need to knuckle down and rehearse for this gig we've got coming up, rather than sort of telling jokes and stories. I suppose also, we're not a professional band. We're not out touring for months at a time. We're doing gigs here and there. Often they come in a cluster. We've got several gigs over the summer at festivals and so on, and then we've got one in the autumn currently, and then we've got our Christmas season. We always do some sort of winter and Christmas themed gigs. Particularly, there's one at the Holywell Music Room in Oxford that I think we've only missed 2 years in all of those 30 years, and one of those obviously was because of the pandemic. And it's not just the band. In fact, there's quite a lot of the audience that's probably not many that have been coming for every single year for 30 years, but there's quite a lot that have been coming for most of those years. So, we've got quite a loyal following.
Actually, do you know what? That's funny. Chatting to bands throughout the sort of years that Get Radio's been running, the folk scene seems to have that loyalty where I guess bands can have that longevity and last so long. But people kind of have an affinity with you, a connection with you, more than other music, I feel. Yeah,
to be honest, even the biggest sort of stars, if you like, on the folk scene are not inaccessible. So, for instance, I don't know if you've heard of the band Bellowhead, who started off in Oxford and became massive. Well, John Bowden is the lead singer with Bellowhead. He lived in, was a time, probably going back 20 years ago, or perhaps a bit more, but he was living in a flat in the the Half Moon in Oxford. And one of the other residents of the sort of upstairs accommodation was Ian Giles, who's our lead singer. And so, we're really good friends with John, and also John Spires. But the thing is that, there's other people who are not necessarily local, but that are sort of like at the top of the tree or top of the billing at folk gigs, and they're perfectly happily come along and just talk to anyone, so it is quite a family, and some people get up on stage and perform, and some sort of perform in their own homes, or just in folk clubs in sort of smaller gatherings where other people aren't paying perhaps, but it's quite a community.
Yeah, that's a great word. The folk community. It feels like it's thriving. I wanted to sort of touch on what sort of changes have you seen? I mean, you've been involved in the folk scene for 30 years. What sort of changes have you seen for better, for worse?
Well, COVID has really hit a lot of performers and venues and folk clubs, I think. Those that do rely on it for their living are are finding, well, maybe it's getting a little bit more like back to normal, but certainly last year, it was really difficult. Not everyone was happy to go out to a gig, and venues were sort of booking, but then cancelling because they, a few days before they hadn't got the enough bums on seats. And I think a lot of folk clubs, which often have been running for a long time, often by, people like me with grey hair, and, they had to stop during COVID and have not necessarily started up. I mean, musically, it's a funny thing that in the folk clubs, it is mostly people with grey hair, even when it's a young performer, someone in their 20s or 30s. But if you go to a festival, like Sidmouth is one of the really big ones, but also Towersey Festival more locally, you'll get loads and loads of youngsters having a great time. So I think, the folk music is probably thriving. There's plenty of young Morris dancers, but they're not necessarily, although there's not an age divide, but they're not necessarily going to the same venues. And in terms of when we started, we've always focused on, well, originally we focused on Oxfordshire music. That was our project. And then we've kind of broadened out. We mostly do traditional English music, not in a nationalistic way, it's just that, that's what we've decided to play. There didn't seem to be that many bands playing English traditional music, whereas now there are loads and loads, bands like Bellowhead, who are very adventurous, but actually at their core, it's English traditional music. And I think there's more young musicians coming through, often playing English music to an incredibly high standard. So whilst I absolutely love Irish and Scottish and American music, I think they're challenging that perception that actually all folk music is Irish. If it's a fast tune, it's Irish and it's not English. Actually, there's plenty of good English tunes, plenty of good Oxfordshire tunes for that matter.
Oh, brilliant stuff. I love whether people are maybe not sort of interested in it or maybe not discovered it yet. I find it so fascinating chatting to people about different music genres and their kind of interest and where it's come from. It's really interesting, fascinating. We're going to be playing The Dancing here on Get Radio. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, of course, so I suggested this, which in some ways is not typical because it was written comparatively recently by two Scottish guys. It was written up, they were involved in an oral reminiscence project up in Kirkcaldy in Fife, which apparently was a sort of a big place for flax milling. And so that, that was the standard occupation. And what they've drawn out from these conversations with old people is that, well, yeah, it was hard work in the mills, but then at the weekend we'd go out dancing, and what a great thing dancing was. So we learnt this from an album by a well-known singer called June Tabor, and we sort of did our own arrangement of it. And it was the lead-off track from an album that we put out it's about 5 years ago now, I think, called 3/4 time, which is, so in other words, waltz time, which is a phrase that crops up in this. And it's got a nice chorus, and it's always a good one when we play this live, because that's another one of the great things about folk scene. People do love to join in the choruses, and they get the opportunity with this.
Oh, superb, Andy. It's been a joy and a pleasure catching up with you. Where can we find out a little bit more about Magpie Lane website?
We have a website, which is quite straightforward, magpielane.co.uk, and our 3 most recent albums, obviously there's a link from the website, but they're all available on Bandcamp, which is a really good way for whether you want to purchase the CD or just download stuff in a secure way. And and I think the next local gig we have is one that we're doing in Leafield Church in October. I can't remember the exact date, but that's on our website. And then we'll be in the Holywell at Christmas, as we always are.
Oh, fantastic. Well, look, make sure you check out Magpie Lane. We'll give The Dancing a spin now, a brilliant tune. And Andy, great catching up with you.